You want to plan in collaboration with not only the child, but the family and the caregivers, because one of the things that I've come across several times is where you as, or me as the therapist, has this beautiful sensory diet all written up, but many of the activities aren't really able to be integrated, or the family or the caregivers don't believe that they can be integrated into their schedule. So it's really helpful to sit down and have a conversation with everybody involved and say, okay, like maybe we'll trial this out, or these are times where you can incorporate this activity here. This would be a good time. Or after they have tried it for a couple weeks, come back and say what's working, what's not, and how can we make this really a usable document, a usable idea, so that that child gets what they need when they need it. Activities should be based on a child's preference, and so when you have, if you put out a bunch of sensory activities and you see what the child is gravitating towards, that's ultimately your ideal. You don't want to be forcing a child to engage in sensory activities. This should be something that their body needs and should feel good to them. Now the difficulty is sometimes you let a child gravitate towards their preferences. The trampoline is something that I think about, where they'll go onto the trampoline and they'll bounce and get themselves in a good space, but then they bounce and then they end up bouncing like off the wall. They get so overstimulated because that initial amount of time was beneficial, but then they got too much. So it is quite possible to have a child fluctuate between hypersensitive and hyposensitive times throughout the day, throughout activities. And I think why it is important, when we were talking about in part 1 of this webinar, what the different hypo and hypersensitivities look like, why that's important is because knowing where a child is going to help you choose the correct activities. So we'll talk about those activities in this section. Thinking about being multisensory, so we learned about the different sensory components: tactile, proprioceptive, vestibular, auditory, and visual, and thinking about really trying to use and incorporate all of those senses into the sensory diet is helpful. And ultimately, we always strive to be age and or developmentally appropriate, so selecting activities that I think as individuals get older, I think people feel like it's a little bit harder to come up with activities, but we all do things throughout our day to help keep us in that optimal level of arousal. I take myself, for example. I work all day. By the end of the day, I start to feel that like crawling out of my skin feeling, so I go to the gym. That's one way I know I get some heavy work, I get some proprioceptive input, I get some vestibular input. That helps bring me to a level where I'm able to get through my evening, go home, make dinner, do whatever work I need to do, settle, and fall asleep. Now, going to the gym works for me. That might not work for somebody else. Many people I know go and watch the news, the nightly news, or they'll listen to some music on their way home. Everybody has their own strategies. So thinking about using those strategies and being appropriate, developmentally appropriate when you are thinking about them. Principles and approaches. What you want to think about is using a variety of activities throughout the day. So you have some powerful, long-lasting, what we call state-changing activities. Your state-changing activities, this is the big, like, write it down moment, are your tactile activities, your vestibular activities, and your proprioceptive activities. These activities are going to have the most long-lasting impacts on your neurologic system, on your arousal level. So when you're looking for something, when a child really seems like they're having a really hard time, they've had a meltdown, you're going to things like proprioceptive information, like a weighted blanket, a weighted vest, you're giving hugs, you're giving deep pressure. those proprioceptive activities are going to be the most helpful for you and last the longest. But then we also have what we call mood makers, where those are kind of like your little snacks throughout the day, if we were equating it to that nutritional analogy. So mood makers are considered more maybe your fidget toys, maybe listening to some music, or using a lava lamp, some visual input. So things that are still considered sensory breaks or sensory activities, but they just don't have as great of an effect on your neurological system. Timing is everything. So as I had mentioned earlier, you want to have activities that are both repeated throughout the day to maintain that optimal level of organization, but then if you know that there's a specific time of day or an activity that's particularly challenging, you want to insert an activity right before that to help that child get some more organization to manage that difficult time. This slide shows a little boy. He's crawling through a tunnel and he's pushing a weighted ball. So this would be considered a pretty large, a state-changing activity, because he's getting the proprioceptive input and the tactile input of crawling on the floor through that tunnel. The tactile component is feeling the tunnel on his hands. The proprioceptive component is the input to his joints, that deep pressure into his joints, his arms and his legs as he's crawling. You also get some proprioceptive input from the weighted ball that he's pushing, and that's also giving really good heavy work to his upper body. Then you have the vestibular component where he's crawling, so he's gotten his head, instead of being in an upright position, it's slightly more inverted, just getting him off of that standing plane and more in that crawling movement pattern. So that's considered a big state changer, versus this slide has some fidget toys, it has therapy putty, it has a brush, and these activities are more kind of things that you might be able to get through, like the last 5 minutes of a group that you might just need somebody to sit down while you finish up a group activity, versus having that state changer as an activity that you would do before the group so that they'd be able to sit down and get through a half an hour group. Thinking about how you're using equipment and materials. So this is a little girl who is in a net swing, and she's positioned seated in the net swing. She's in this flexed position. Her vision is kind of inward. She's holding onto a little stuffed animal as she's getting that swinging motion of the net swing. So that's, if you look at her, that I would consider that more of a calming activity. So if you were rocking her, swinging her in a linear, repetitive kind of back and forth motion, that would be considered calming. Versus that same activity with a different setup. So it's a net swing, similar net swing, but instead of the child being in a flex position with her vision inward, she's on her belly and her vision is outward. So at this point, this is an activity where I might have her reaching out to get materials and maybe throwing a beanbag at a target. So that's really going to be alerting. It's going to be more of a ramping up your system, getting yourself energized to be able to participate in an activity. So thinking about using similar materials, but you need to have an idea of where that student is and where their arousal level is so that you're able to use that material in the best way to serve that child.